One of the common complaints about Brightspace assignments, the view when looking through the assignment dashboard, for example, is about the lack of visibility during the marking process of grades as they're happening. So if we open one of these assessment portals, for example, we can see there are hundreds of submissions in here. And going in during the submission process, we haven't hit the due date yet, for example. We've got extensions happening, other things going on. I've got no idea what the scores are for these papers when they are marked. These ones at the moment don't say draft saved, so they haven't been marked yet. They're waiting to be marked, but we're going to have papers that have been marked, and all we're going to see is draft saved, and in fact, no information about the score for the assignments until we go in and open up each of those individual evaluations. So whilst I can see Turnitin scores, for example, here, and I can see submission timestamps, there's nothing in here that gives me a view of what their current score is as per the markers, their draft markers. Until we actually end up publishing these papers, at that point maybe the subject convener is going to start looking at using the grade moderation tool, for example, hiding the submission portals, hiding gradebook columns. But there is, in fact, a mechanism within Brightspace that will allow you to get a top-down view and far greater visibility of the grade distribution during the marking process, as well as your marker progression, where your markers are up to. What it requires is two things. One of them is that there is a rubric in place, a properly built rubric in place for the assignment. So I'm going to have a look here in the subject admin assessment rubrics area, and I can see that there is a rubric attached. It's locked because we've got submissions and marking happening already. And if we have a look at this rubric just at a glance, what we can see is that this is a quantified rubric. So we've got a custom points rubric with points being allocated for each criterion. So the first one out of 20, 20, 20, and then a couple of 10s. So it's going to give us a score out of 100. But most importantly for this process, this overall score section down the bottom has been populated. By default, this reads level 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it has nothing to do with the points, etc. that you've set up here. It doesn't really have any meaning until you give it meaning. So you do have to populate the overall score section of the rubric to make sure that it's correct. And when you're marking out of 100 in the rubric, that's obviously much easier. So at that point I can say, yep, a HD is 84% or more, distinction is 75 to 84%, and so on and so forth. As long as this is in place, we've got one of the two components required to do this moderation process. So the first part is to have a rubric that's been put together properly with an overall score section that is accurate. That is that the HD through fail continuum and the points required to achieve each, depending on whatever this total is, have been populated. So that's the first part. The other thing that we need in place to get a good look at our marker progress is marking teams. So using the actual groups tool, if you've created marking teams, and we have other videos on doing that, but hopefully you've created a group category for marking, and if I have a look in here, yep, there's one category for groups called marking teams. And in this subject with 600 students, they in fact have 31 different groups or marking teams. Looks like they've been split, the cohort's been split into blocks of 20, and then different markers have been allocated a certain number of those blocks depending on their capacity. So whoever JS is, for example, they've got 60 students. SB 60, FN's got 40, GR's got 40. So what you're going to see is that some of the markers will have a smaller capacity, 20 students, others will have more, 40, 60, and so on and so forth. But the important part is we have marking teams so that we can use the groups tool to be able to filter between different markers. So properly set up rubric and marking teams in place in the groups tool. Once we have those two things in place, we're now able to go into the subject admin area, find our rubric, and marking. I know that marking has started, but I want to check on the progress of that marking. And I do that by coming into Subject Admin Rubrics, and then next to the rubric that I want to look at, hit the drop down and view Statistics. Now what this opens up, this first screen doesn't tell me much, and that's because we don't use this aspect of Brightspace. We don't have associations in place, etc. We don't use that tool. What we're going to be looking at is this Competency Activities tab. So this has a look at the rubric status as it stands currently, and what I can see of the marking process for Assessment 3 is that 44 of those assessments have currently been draft marked, so the rubric's been used for marking. For 44 papers, the markers have hit Save Draft. That's all I need to be able to check in here to be able to see what that progress is up to. From those 44 that are marked, the average currently is a credit, and in the scoring that we had for that rubric, which was out of 100, that equates to 66%. Okay? If your task was, the rubric was out of 40, this number is going to look a bit different, right? But this one's out of 100, so that's why I can see that the credit is 66% as the average score. Okay, so there's some starting information. Let's keep going. If we click on this Actions button, we now get an overall summary of the split for this task. So I can see for each of the criterion scales, for the totals, 9% of those 44 papers has been given a HD, 9% is a fail. So we get that top-down view of this spread, the grade distribution for marking as it stands currently. And I can actually now go into a couple of other tabs that we have here. Criteria Statistics will give us that split against each criterion in the rubric. So this is probably more for an end of session review period when you're looking at the quality of the assessment and whether or not you need changes against how it's marked, or if it's set at an appropriate level, if some of the criteria need to be adjusted, etc. But I can see the spread of the student responses against each of those criterion. So you can see at this point it's fairly even between the middle three. Some other questions I'm expecting to see fewer HDs. The percentage starts to change. We can see that criterion 4, for example, looks like more students are struggling with that one, for example, getting closer to the pass mark. Some of them are more highly tilted towards the top end, and so on and so forth. So when you're in a position to want to look at the spread of scores against individual criterion, this will be waiting for you underneath Criteria Statistics. But perhaps the most important for what I want to talk about today is this last tab, which is Individual Statistics. This tab will give us a view of those rubric scores at the individual student level to begin with. We're looking at our user view, which is all students. So it's showing me at this stage the 44 that have been marked. We can see here their individual marks, so I'm getting a top-down view of those scores. You'll notice here that we have an assessor column, so I can see which markers have marked those papers. So it looks like it's currently time-stamped against, in the far right column. You can sort ascending and descending against submission times. You can sort ascending and descending against your markers. So if it's changing it to the other end of the student level, I'm going to flip it again. We can see here, those are the papers that this marker has done so far, and then we have some of the others. So this is giving me a bit of a view of my marker progress. And obviously, as we get more of those 600 papers in, this is going to become more important. You get up to 200, a view of up to 200 students in the list using this tool. That's as high as it goes. So if your cohort is bigger than that, you're going to be going through multiple pages. So we get a top-down view at that point of up to 200 student scores on the one page. But we also have a view by toggle, a filter, that we can then change to either groups or sections. So if your markers, for example, have just been told, well, you're doing Bathurst distance and you're doing Wagga internal, etc., well, you can use the sections to filter this list down to particular markers. However, if you've set up marking teams in the Groups tool, we can now apply our View by Groups filter, hit Apply, choose which groups we're talking about. So the groups in this subject, the groups category we set up was called Marking Teams. There they are, Marking Teams. And if I wanted to look at the progress of one of these markers, I'll pick on JS and their first block of 20 students, hit Apply. And we can see, well, they haven't done any at this stage. Let's choose a different marker. Let's try SB and apply. So they've done 3 so far, so I'm able to check on the progress of each of my markers. So partly this tells me I've got to think a little bit about how big each of those groups are. If you've got a larger group for each of your markers, you're going to be able to see more of a view. This one will show me each of those groups with up to 20 students in each. But I get a top-down view of their marker progress at this point during the marking process. So I don't have to wait for all of the publishing and everything to be wrapped up weeks after the marking has commenced. So that makes this tool potentially quite valuable to you as long as those 2 elements are in place. A correctly set up rubric and marking teams in place so you can apply your group's filter, View By. So that may be of some use to you. Enjoy!